Most of Clive Barker's stories can be summed up pretty easily. His stories typically have someone or something unlocking a fantasy world, a world adjacent to our own yet filled with supernatural elements. Examples of this include saying Candyman's name in the mirror 5 times, unlocking the puzzle box in Hellraiser, or stumbling upon the lost remains of Midian, a place where the monsters go in Nightbreed. These are magical stories, supernatural ones, fantasy stories. Barker was aware of his influence on impressionable youth and disliked movies and media portraying madmen on the loose, as it could perpetuate violence within his community.
If you are talking about a movie which is solely based upon psychos on the loose, for instance, in which you take vulnerable teenagers and you just kill them one by one with machetes or whatever else, I think that's unhealthy. I try, with one exception, in all my fiction, the stories are based in something supernatural or fantastical. I don't write psycho on the loose stories.
So, in all of his stories, he had elements of the supernatural, fantasy worlds in which the darkness arrives. He was a fan of using strong, fantastical metaphors to tell his tales of the macabre. But there was one story early on that took place in the world that we all live in, a story that ditched the supernatural and instead focused and dove in to the depravity of man. That story was found in the Books of Blood Volume 2. That story was Dread. Dread is the only Barker fiction that doesn't have any supernatural elements, but instead plays out more like a madman on the loose kind of story. It's actually one of my favorite Barker stories due to that fact. There were talks about making Dread a movie starting way back in 1999 through 2002. Fox was seriously considering making Dread, but if you saw my review on the made-for-TV movie Clive Barker Saint Sinner, then you know that Fox would rather spend time talking about making movies from Clive Barker's work rather than actually making them. As the deal with Fox fell through, Barker went on to form his own production company, The Midnight Picture Show, with aspirations to make at least 8 full-length feature films based on the stories found within the Books of Blood anthology. This was finally it. After years of being stuck in production hell, Barker and crew finally had a chance to make the movies they wanted. Barker was executive producer and had final say on all scripts and films, but mostly let the different artists do their own take on his stories. This wave was to start with the Midnight Meat Train in 2008, and then Book of Blood and Dread were to follow in 2009. Many more films were planned. So how did this stretch end up panning out? With Dread being the last film based off Clive Barker's work for well over a decade, it's safe to say that this effort was a complete failure, but maybe not for the reasons you think. Let's dive in to Dread. Welcome to the HellBound Horror Show. Dread focuses on shy and reserved Stephen Grace, a film student at the university who meets Quaid, a philosophy student at the same school. The two hit it off. Quaid is a bit abrasive, but there's a strength in him that lures Stephen to him. Quaid is obsessed with fear, but more importantly, dread. He proposes to do a fear study as a final project. With Stephen filming, they could make a heck of a film. The focus will be finding out what people are afraid of. When Quaid was just 6 years old, an axe-wielding madman broke into his house and killed his parents. Check out the sound design in this scene.
This is your mother, your father.
Haunting and gruesome. And the idea of all that's left of your parents are the blood that is spilt is a grisly one. I love this scene. Due to his childhood trauma, Quaid now has a fear of axe-wielding madmen, an obsession. He has nightmares every night about it, and he thinks by having a fear study and living through someone else's fear vicariously, he can isolate his own internal fears and get rid of them. Steven and Quaid enlist the help of film editor Cheryl, another student. Together they make flyers and begin their research. At first, Quaid isn't happy with the results. Fear of spiders? That's not real dread. Cheryl decides to open up on camera and a real breakthrough happens. Cheryl talks about how when she was a kid, her father worked at a meat packing factory. When he would return at home at night, he stunk of raw meat, of iron from the blood of cattle. He would sneak into her room at night and do very, very bad things to her. She can't stand meat now. She's a vegetarian, and the thought of meat makes her sick.
That's what I'm talking about. Some f***ing honest-to-God trauma.
Another breakthrough is from Joshua. He was in a car accident as a kid, and for a few years he lost his hearing. Joshua is deathly afraid of becoming deaf again. And here is the biggest difference between the short story and the movie. In the book, Steven was the one who was afraid of being deaf again, but a new backstory was written for him for the film. This sets up a very different ending, but both endings are fantastic. I don't think the book's ending would translate as well on screen, so I'm all for this change. And quick side note, Barker was actually deaf for a brief period as a child, so this story hits very close to his heart. Basically, as the story progresses, Quaid begins to lose himself. His nightmares of an axe-wielding murderer are becoming less frequent, so he wants to continue with the fear study, but he wants to push it to the next level. And Quaid is slowly becoming a madman. He wants to push people to their absolute limits. He harasses a girl with large birthmarks on the right side of her body until she takes a bath in bleach and uses steel wool to try to scrape away her imperfections. He shoots Joshua in the ears to make him deaf again, and the worst is what he does to Cheryl. He locks her in a room with a well-cooked steak. She's trapped in this room as he films her. She tries to get out, and at first she thinks that she can outlast him, but days and days begin to tick by. She won't touch the meat, but she is slowly getting hungrier and hungrier. The more she waits, the more ripe and rancid the meat becomes. At what point will her will break? This meat scene is part of the climax of the movie, and of course studio execs hated it. They thought the scene was unrelatable and that it wasn't very climactic. When the movie was eventually shown at theaters, the meat scene was all audiences could talk about. They raved about it. Turns out that studio execs don't know anything. Shocking, I know. The meat scene is one of the most memorable Barker moments and the best scene of the movie. Will Cheryl break and eat the meat? What will happen to Steven and the ones that Quaid has wronged? And will Quaid ever free himself of dread? I love Dread, both the story and the movie. Is it a perfect Barker adaptation? No, but it retains much of the themes and is a kick-butt flick. Performances are all top-notch. This is seriously a great cast. First-time director and longtime Barker collaborator Anthony DiBlasi does a great job too. I like what he added to the story and I don't mind the changes. I love how personal and claustrophobic he makes the film. He loves his close-ups. Now, I'm not a fan of the color grading though. The contrast is through the roof. Anything that has any kind of light source on it is blown out, and sometimes people look like they have jaundice. I also hate the blue tint that they use outdoors. There's also a few scenes where the 180-degree film rule becomes merely a recommendation. And what's with this crappy frame rate and shaky camera? I hate this. And yes, while I do complain, there are parts that are praiseworthy too. I love the fixed camera on the axe as it travels up the steps. I also love how they infuse a bit of color into some of the shots. Sound design is great too. I love the muffled, deafening sounds.
Good. You're awake. I was getting tired of waiting. Can you hear me?
Music is mostly comprised of different contemporary bands, but it fits the mood. Dread is a great movie and one of Barker's best adaptations, definitely top 5 or 6. I also love the idea that monsters aren't always born, sometimes they're made. And in Dread, monsters are made. Barker and director Anthony DiBlasi had plans to make Pig Blood Blues in the next few months following the release of Dread, But unfortunately, the failure of the Book of Blood, Midnight Meat Train, and Dread put an end to the Midnight Picture Show and any hopes of adapting Barker's work for the next decade. It's a real shame, as it feels like studio execs yet again screwed over Barker and his team. I really thought Barker and the Midnight Picture Show were onto something, but at the end of the day, money talks. Sucks that we haven't gotten more of Barker's adaptations. On Halloween, we are going to end our retrospective on Clive Barker and his film adaptations with 2020's Books of Blood, a Hulu original movie. Who would have thought? I hope to see you there, and in the meantime, stay spooky, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do and want to support the channel, please consider subscribing or by buying me a coffee in the description below. Any bit helps. Thank you, and take care.